Welcome all. I'm George Pagoulatos. It is my pleasure to introduce this panel, which draws on the theme of the December 2023 OECD Global Strategy Group, bringing together 38 member states with the Secretariat to discuss on the strategy of the advanced economies and the state of the world. And it's a great pleasure to be moderating this panel of very distinguished speakers. I'm very glad to introduce Sylvie Goulard, who has a long, distinguished track record as, among others, a minister, an MEP, and today a professor at Bocconi. Welcome, Sylvie. Luis de Mello, who is the director of the economics department of the OECD. Welcome, Luis. And Gerasimos Thomas, the director general of DG Tax of the European Commission. Let me try and lay out the groundwork before we kick off the discussion, because we are in an environment of two wars raging in Europe's eastern and southern neighborhood, each with a serious risk of escalation. Russian aggression has led to a rise of defense spending. 23 NATO members this year will reach or exceed the 2% target. Only 11 of them were there last year, and only 3 of them were there in 2014. We are at a time of geoeconomic fragmentation. The well-hailed peace dividend that we had at the heyday of globalization is evaporating, and so are the efficiency gains of economic interdependence at the time of decoupling or de-risking or breakup of global supply chains, and at a time where interdependence is being seen increasingly as a factor of vulnerability rather than a strength. And in this environment, what we will try to address today is the economic and fiscal and public policy implications of this geopolitical environment. And I would like to begin the discussion by turning to Sylvie. Sylvie, where do you see the state of the world, first of all, in terms of the fragmentation that I've discovered, that I've described, in terms of the geopolitical order that is emerging, and in terms of the broader economic implications of these developments?
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me here in Delphi, one of the best possible places to try to think long-term and not short-term, as we too often do. You described very well the situation. I'm not going back to the risks. If I may, I would like to insist a little bit on climate change and also the implications on nature. I'm currently co-chair of a Franco-British initiative with a global reach on for the creation of some financial instruments for nature restoration. And it is clear that if you look at the question of climate, it is difficult enough, but if you add the environmental dimension, you see some trade-offs, and you can see also some synergies. So first point, if I may add to your introduction, the situation is very serious. Not only because of war, but because of this invisible war we are making ourselves to the planet. And I'm going to be blunt, I'm not in charge, I'm an academic. We are not where we should be. We are not where we should be. It is serious, it is urgent. I'm not a scientist, but we may reach tipping points. And if we reach some tipping points, of course, we don't know what is going to happen because the situation is unique. So I don't want to be too negative or insist on the dark side, but even when we meet, and it's very nice, but we all took the plane to come here to discuss on the urgency to tackle the climate issue. So I include myself in the people having some contradictions, because I'm very happy to be here. But once again, I'm not sure we are changing enough our lives in order to make the transition we all wish happen. The second point, I will focus on Europe, being a European. The problem is not a European one. The rise of nationalism, of aggressivity, the the new paradigm in economics, which is no more based on trade and open borders and exchange, etc., but much more on some protectionist views. This change is true for the whole world, so it's not only a European problem. But in Europe, we have a very specific problem, is that I don't know exactly where we are in the European integration. We managed to have a single currency, we managed to have a single market, we have lots of instruments, we have the only supranational parliament worldwide. So I don't want to say that what was achieved is nothing, because we are even at the avant-garde. But the rest of the world does not always believe in rule-based orders or in what we considered the model that could become the one dominating. And this is the tricky question, I'm not sure we really believe in it. Are we ready to fight against Russia for our values as we pretend? Are we ready to spend more for something common? Are we ready to fight for the single market, which is right now showing some signs of weaknesses? Because when you suspend the state aids, for example, you give the largest member states a very strong advantage, etc., etc. So I'm not going to say that it is easy. What I want to say is that we have a fantastic tool, which is the European Union. It was created at a time where the world was maybe, even if with the Cold War it was not easy, but less a world in which we were on the defensive side. We are aging societies, and to go to the point of fiscal discipline, etc., what is worrying me is that we can all make the list of the new expenditures we need. Everybody's coming, well, we need more for defense, we need more for education, because we need to reskill people for IA, we need more money for the energy transition, etc., etc. But some states, including mine, France, are over-indebted already. So where are the margins of maneuver? So there is something which is a little bit of the unsaid or unknown problem of the next European election, and I'm sure there will be no debate on that, is where is the money coming from? If you spend more for military purposes, is your people ready to spend less for what? For social, for education, for health, for whatever? It's not up to one person to decide, but I see a lack of discussion and maybe a lack of, if I may say so, gravitas in the political debate, where very few politicians are telling the truth, which is that the time is not the easiest one. Once again, I really believe that we have tools, that we could do more, uniting more. And maybe the story of the Greek cities fighting against each other and one day overwhelmed by the Roman Empire should be something we keep in our mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Sylvie, for introducing the discussion by focusing on the mismatch between rhetoric and actual delivery, actual practice, focusing on the shortfall on climate spending and the climate crisis. The most important global unifier in a way is the climate crisis, and yet it finds us at a time where global governance is fragmenting. It's not just geoeconomic fragmentation, it's a fragmentation of global multilateral organizations and their inability to support global public goods such as climate protection, such as the rules-based order that you mentioned, including rules-based trade, and of course the importance of the hard trade-offs that you mentioned at the time of fiscal constraints. How are we going to finance these priorities and these objectives? How are we going to choose between different and competing objectives? So this gives me the opportunity to turn to Luis. Luis, how do you see the longer-term economic trends evolving in terms of growth potential, in terms of productivity trends, and how are they hampered by aging as a factor that has already been mentioned by Sylvie?
Thanks, George. Thanks. Great questions. I think we could spend a few days talking about some of them, but also great to be here with the Sylvie, with the Gerasimos. Let me pick up on the issue that then you suggested, George, of aging, and then Sylvie, you mentioned climate change. I'm sure we'll come back to these points, but let me take a few minutes to talk about aging, and then that will lead me into another topic that I find probably one of the single most challenges for our economies, which is slow productivity growth. No? I mean, aging, we all know the problems associated with aging. I mean, I'm not going to be saying anything that any of us here hasn't heard already. Impacts on labor supply at times where our economies are, you know, the key drivers of long-term growth are weakening in our economies. Issues related to the public finances, and as Sylvie mentioned, just to cite a fairly alarming number, if you look at OECD countries over the next 30 years, pressures related to healthcare, long-term care, and pensions alone, that is equivalent to 6.25% of GDP for the median OECD countries. So in 30 years, we're going to be spending more to the tune of 6.25%. This is not trivial. This is not uncertain, based on policy settings that we have today, and based on fairly standard projections for demographic changes in our economies. That's what you get. Okay? We're talking about some of the countries that will face most of the pressure, that already have very high debt to GDP ratios, and already have a very high revenue to GDP ratio. So it's not that you can essentially, you know, raise revenues to get out of the problem. So I would say that a lot of the policies that are required to deal with this are very difficult politically. A lot of it has to do with society's willingness to let go of some of the entitlements that we have. A lot of it has to do with abilities, obviously, to get our economies to work on a different basis. So far, so good. There is nothing terribly new about it. The issue is, are we internalizing the magnitudes involved in this? Are we creating the conditions for the type of reform changes that will be needed going forward? Are we working on our pension systems the way we should? Are we working on activation policies to make sure that you know, older workers stay connected to the labor force? Are we working, to go back to Sylvie, you mentioned skilling and upskilling of the labor force, all that. I think by and large the answer is that, well, we're some way from addressing the issues that we need. So let me move on to the other point which is connected to this. What does it mean in terms of productivity growth? What it means in terms of our abilities to grow in a sustained manner in our societies? Again, another alarming number. OECD countries on average now grow potentially, so our estimate of the rate of growth of potential GDP in the OECD area is about 1.5%, right? At the turn of the millennium, just 25 years ago, that number was a percentage point higher. If you go back another 20 years, you would add about, you know, between half and a percentage point higher to that. So we're slowing down. Our ability to grow in a sustained manner is growing down. Population aging doesn't happen. The trends in investment that we are seeing are not moving in the right direction. So there are a number of challenges associated with restoring the ability of our economies to produce in a more productive manner, so that we can grow in a sustained manner for longer, address some of these issues that we have covered and I will be covering. But there is an element that is less spoken about related to productivity. It's not only that on average it is coming down for most of the advanced economies, is that diversion is also increasing across firms. It's fine to look at the national accounts and the numbers for the average, or on average for an economy. But the gap between the firms that are at the frontier, in sectors that are at the frontier, and the rest of our economies is also increasing. So there is a challenge here that is not only restore the ability to increase productivity, but making sure that there is more diffusion in our economies. It's not healthy for an economy to grow on the basis of a handful of sectors or a handful of companies that grow and that are very productive when the rest is lagging behind. because that affects the ability of our economies to basically, redistribute income, create jobs that are of quality across the different spectrums of our societies. So I would say, and I'll stop here now, George, that to me those two challenges alone, in addition to climate change, in addition to other spending pressures that we have, not least defense, as you mentioned, George, all the other, let's say, slow-moving, longer-term challenges that we're facing, those two, to me, are the ones that are probably, if not the most, but among the top 5 there. One, aging, because it's not that uncertain. We know the numbers. The other one, productivity growth, because it's very complex to address. And reversing a trend of already 40, 50 years is going to take a lot of action, of courage on the part of policy. Thanks.
Thank you, Luis, for painting a very realistic picture of the declining productivity rates, especially in advanced economies, the declining growth potential as a result of that, as a result of aging, and the growing spending needs, which will be constraining future political and policy choices and intensifying the kind of trade-offs that we mentioned before. On the other hand, the revenue base of government budgets is also facing very significant constraints, having to do with tax base erosion, having to do with harmful tax competition, and the inability so far to bring about a closer tax coordination at a global level, at least among the developed economies. So I'd like to ask you, Gerasime, how do you see the effort to that direction, and how can tax policy improve the capacity of advanced economies to invest in climate objectives, and I would also say to invest in the ability of the developing world to combat climate change for various reasons, which do not only have to do with solidarity, but also to the enlightened self-interest of the developed world in being able to facilitate a kind of a global response to climate change. Gerasime, you have the floor.
Thank you. You're asking the taxman to be the optimist here after the first 2 introductions. Well, I think it is true that we have these big challenges from aging. We have big challenges from the climate crisis. And as the title of our panel says, we need economic and fiscal survival. I think we can survive, but our ambition should be beyond survival. It should be about adjustment. And I think Europe has always had a deficit in adjusting outside the crisis. We have been fairly good in reacting to crisis, but we have not been very good in normal times to move forward, and that is what is needed. This is a lot about politics and the elections that will happen in the at the European level or at the national level, but I think that should be our adjustment. I will take a bit more, try to construct on the positive news. On the positive news, I think that we have an economic governance reform that it is going to be voted finally and enter into place now in May. This will set the framework, a different framework to survey our fiscal policies at the EU level than the one that we had over the first years of the creation of the euro. It still has certain rigidities. It focuses a lot on spending control. And I think we need to look more and build on this and look at the revenue side. At the revenue side, if we look at Europe as a whole, if we look at the tax mix, structurally we had 50% of the taxes in Europe are taxes on labor. We tax the people who work, we tax social security. So 50% of the average revenue in Europe comes at labor, and this is too much. It is too much in an area where we have a very tight labor market, and we need to get people into the labor market. It's too much even to get the immigrants to work, to give incentives to work. We have 27% on consumption taxes. Mainly VAT, some other consumption taxes, so everything else is the rest. Corporate taxation, big corporate taxation is only on average 7% in Europe. Now, let's look at the positives. The economic governance review gave us a framework to review a little bit the spending. I think the global tax deal led by the OECD and involving 140 countries, the Pillar 2 that it is adopted and it is a reality as of the 1st of January 2024. It covers all multinational enterprises with more than 750 million euro annual revenue. It is imposing a minimum taxation of 15%, a minimum 15% effective tax rate. This is raising the level playing field. In some cases, companies will move out of low tax jurisdictions and move back to others. In some other cases, which on a global level is also not so bad, is that these jurisdictions, whether they are in developing countries or elsewhere, they will raise their domestic taxes. Because to go back to Sylvie's point, it's not only about raising revenue for us, it's raising revenue for the planet, and therefore we are co-chairing as TaxSud, the Secretariat, where Sylvie is working on international solutions on climate finance. Having domestic tax revenue also in countries around the world is important. Positive is that in the last G20 meeting with Brazilian presidency, we found a common ground to talk to the Global South about wealth taxation and other taxation and inequalities. Europe has a difficulty in speaking to the Global South. We have a difficulty in establishing this dialogue, whether it is about tax or about climate, whether it is about economy, but we are gradually opening up this space to speak to the Global South, and it is necessary, and this is something that we have to build upon. So I think if we start discussing this, and mainly G20 is the center of gravity where some decisions has to be made, and then we build on that. I think we can see the way forward. From our point of view, here in Europe, I think we have to look at new areas of revenue. Overall government revenue, it is difficult to be reduced. It has to be restructured. We need a different tax mix, but I don't think it is realistic in Europe, who has wars in its frontier, who is looking to substantially increase defense spending, who has the mega trends of aging, to face and greening its economy. It is very difficult to look at scenarios where the tax revenue will be less, but it can be different, and that is where we are concentrating.
Thank you very much, Gerasimos. I keep from all extremely interesting, important things that you said, your emphasis on adjustment to change, not just in terms of reforming the tax mix, but more broadly. And I think you very aptly pointed out the ability of Europe to adjust to crises when they are abrupt, when they require direct action, but its shortcoming in adjusting to more slow-burning crises that require long-term consistency in implementing policies across time, be that climate or be that, most importantly, aging, which is one of our underlying challenges here. And I'd like to return to Sylvie, because Sylvie, you mentioned a number of different challenges and priorities that European governments have, and more broadly, the developed world has. And the question is, in such an adverse macro environment and in a fiscal environment where economies are faced with high public debt, legacy debt, and are bound to enroll into fiscal consolidation policies, what are we to choose? What are we to prioritize? It seems that the bill is getting higher in a number of areas, from financing green transition to financing technological transition, to trying to gain, for example, European leadership on new technologies and AI, to supporting the developing world in its climate effort, and of course, revamping the defense capabilities and the security priorities of Europe. It seems that this is a large number of objectives for economies which also have to fend off the challenges to our democracy as well. and the inability to adhere to a social contract breeds populism, as we have seen in other jurisdictions of the world. So how should we prioritize these valuable objectives that you mentioned?
I'm certainly not going to answer your question. For one simple reason, it's because it is typically a democratic choice. It is not something someone can do, and it's not something the governments should escape. And that's the reason why I mentioned the fact that as we are in an unfinished European Union, where of course we vote for the European Parliament, but at the end, in so many, on so many points, the European Council, which is not directly elected by anyone, but it's just a mix of people elected at national level, if we continue with these kind of institutions, I fear nobody's going to answer your question. Not only I'm not, but I'm really concerned now by the fact that we have created something in Europe since the Lisbon Treaty, which is a very strange way of ruling the European Union, with at the heart a group of people who are all perfectly legitimate at the national level. I don't want to put any doubts on that. But on the other hand, there is no mandate at a certain moment. There is no choice on the orientations. And the only thing they can do, as you said before, as was said before, is just to react when there is such an urgency that you cannot do anything else. So first, to try to answer your question, I really consider that we are not equipped. We are not, and I say it in Greece, it's not just a paradox. We are not equipped for the challenges in front of us in Europe. And what we have may not resist the pressure of the challenges we are facing. I'm not saying this because I don't believe in the European Union. I really believe that we need to make new steps, that we need to strengthen democracy, that we need to rethink the way we take decisions. We cannot have people meeting from time to time in Brussels, behind closed doors, making 27 press conferences at the end of their meeting, and believe with this we can face the Russian threat, we can face all the challenges of the world, we can fight against aging, fight against climate change, etc. So we are now in a situation where we should become serious. If we really want to tackle all these challenges, and I see no reason for Europe not to be able to make such a step, then let's try to think out of the box. So this was the institutional box. If I may say one word to what you said, Luis, sometimes I fear that we don't have the instruments. When you say there is not enough growth, and you compare with 20 years ago, I see your point. But on the other hand, it's exactly the kind of growth that made the world as it is, which is not climate friendly, abusing the resources of the planet. So I'm not saying we don't want growth, but we need to find another way to look at growth and make sure that the figures match what we really want to do, which is another way of producing, another type of mobility, and also another participation. And a very last word, all this will only take place if we have the support of the people. And inclusion is not just something nice for ESG reports, it should be more perceived as a real priority of the governments, and I would say we have the populists we deserve, maybe. Thank you.
So in order not to have the populists we deserve, I'll take one of your final lines, Sylvia, and address it to Luis. You mentioned economic growth, and Luis pointed out the constraining environment under which this objective is pursued. And of course, economic growth is a beautiful thing, except it has one single advantage: governments cannot order it. A number of factors must play out to achieve it. And you have pointed out the constraints, and many of them are not just conjunctural, they correspond to longer-term trends, which means that we are faced with the challenge of perhaps reprioritizing our economic policy mix, redrafting the kind of balance perhaps between fiscal consolidation and protecting investment, or different investment priorities? Gerasimos mentioned the tax revenue mix, and I'd like to pose to you the question: what would be the kind of reprioritization, what would be the kind of economic policy mix that would help us, in the broader sense, both European economies and advanced economies, to withstand these secular constraints that you mentioned and raise productivity growth on the longer term?
Thanks, George. Sylvie, I think really I couldn't agree more with you. That's why I was putting the emphasis really on productivity rather than input utilization. No, I mean, we know that there are limits and there are trade-offs to basically just grow on the basis of more inputs. There are some bright spots, George, and to this point as well, Sylvie. Take, for example, labor force participation. In most of our economies has gone back to pre-pandemic levels on average, in groups that were typically before underutilized, underrepresented in labor forces. More and more, participation increasing among older workers, participation increasing among, youth and among women, among groups that are where participation tends to be lower. Maintaining the impetus of reforms that encourage that, I think that goes in the direction of what you're saying, George. Most of our countries are already recognizing the need to do more on the pension front, so efforts to close pathways to early retirement, making sure that people stay in the labor force longer and so on. Again, good reforms that go in that direction. A lot more turning back to productivity issues. A lot more that is happening, and here I'm generalizing because it varies a lot from country to country, but a lot more of a recognition of activation as a very important measure to do that. A lot more as support for lagging firms, a lot more of support or incentives and to deal with capability obstacles in different sectors of our economy. I would say that there is part of this prioritization that you mentioned, George, has to do with the recognizing up front where the obstacles are, be it in regulations, be it in spending programs, and that would address or recognize those longer-term structural weaknesses in our economy and start acting on them. In many cases, there is a lot of low-hanging fruit that can be exploited. In other cases, it's very painful reforms that will need to be addressed at some point in time. To go back to your point, I think, in Gerasimos, of political leadership, technical competence, expertise, ability to learn, ability to disseminate those experiences as part of the process of addressing them. So I'm afraid I cannot tell you, George, what the recipe would be in general. But making sure that whatever we do in this area is more underpinning by whatever is missing structure in our economies would be a way forward. And then, we address the issue, Sylvie, that you mentioned about not only the what, but the how, which is a big unanswered question. Thanks.
Thank you very much. Gerasimos, your thoughts on how to combine fiscal policy objectives with the primacy of addressing climate change? Is a carbon adjustment mechanism the right way forward? The IFCMA proposed by the OECD is a way forward. We are facing a very serious shortfall on supporting green investment in the developing world of the order of 4 trillion a year. How do we go about all these objectives?
Thank you. I don't think we have the time to go into the depth of this. We have the minister here, the next, but I think what I will highlight from your question is that we need to bring the private sector into the discussion. And I think in ETS, it's an instrument by which we price carbon, and this creates different dynamics. In Europe, it has worked well. In many countries, we have now 53 countries around the world that are looking one way or another into carbon pricing. And this includes developed countries like us, but more in Japan, in South Korea, in China, but even in Morocco, and debated also in Turkey as part of the discussion that we have. Second, I think do not underestimate the capacity of the private sector to adjust. A recent survey of 15,000 companies in Europe find out that 55% of European companies plan to change their supply chain in the next 2 years. It is supply chain disruption is in one in the title of our panel. We might in the government not be ready to know exactly what to do, but the companies do. We have the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is a way to secure certain parts of our border and give incentives to third countries to decarbonize. I was recently in Egypt, the government saying, oh, it is difficult to comply with the methodologies. Our companies in Egypt will never be able to do it. We got the first quarter results. 75% of Egyptian companies, they were perfectly happy reporting with the methodology. I mean, the government is, was trying to figure out. So we need to match in this race that we have of adjustment as Europe and worldwide, whether it is the climate or the mega trends. We need to work together with the private sector, and there is in the real people or the economy or the SMEs or the big companies, there is a dynamism from which we can learn. And that's, I will leave it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Gerasimos. This was the title of this panel was kind of apocalyptic, but it's quite a relief that we ended up with at least a ray of optimism in your last remarks. So I'm very grateful for that. I'm very grateful for your participation, Luis, Sylvie, Gerasimos, in this discussion, and thank you all for attending.
Thank you. Thank you.